On December 29, 2025, while the world was focused on the Iranian nuclear negotiations in Muscat and the American military buildup in the Arabian Sea, the People's Liberation Army quietly launched the largest military exercises around Taiwan since 2022. Justice Mission 2025. 5 operational zones surrounding the island. Naval and Coast Guard assets enforcing simulated blockade corridors. 44 PLA aircraft crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait in a single 24-hour period. Hundreds of civilian flights disrupted. Simulated air and sea control established around Taiwan's major ports. No aircraft carriers participated. Analysts noted that immediately. The PLA was practicing only part of a larger blockade operation, deliberately holding back the carrier element, reserving that scenario for a future exercise when the timing was right. 2 months later, the United States Navy was fully committed to Operation Epic Fury in the Middle East. 3 carriers in the Persian Gulf theater. The USS George Washington alone in the Pacific. Beijing has been watching every day since. This video is not a prediction. It is an analysis of what the strategic situation actually looks like from Beijing's perspective right now, what a Taiwan blockade would require operationally, and what the combination of American commitments in the Middle East, the munitions consumption of 6 weeks of sustained combat operations against Iran, and the lessons China is drawing from Operation Epic Fury means for the most dangerous potential military confrontation of the next decade. The question is not whether China will blockade Taiwan. The question is whether the conditions that China's leadership has been waiting for, the window in which American military capacity is stretched, American attention is divided, and American deterrence is weakest, have ever looked more favorable than they do right now. Let's start with what China learned from watching Operation Epic Fury unfold in real time, because Chinese military analysts were studying every publicly available piece of information from the first hour of the operation with an intensity that American defense officials described privately as total. The first lesson China took from Epic Fury is about the kill chain. The systematic destruction of Iran's navy in 48 hours, the submarine torpedo that sank the Iris Dana 1,500 miles from Iran's coast, the simultaneous multi-axis strike that overwhelmed Iran's integrated air defense network in the opening hours. All of this demonstrated that the United States Navy's kill chain from intelligence collection to weapons employment is faster, more precise, and more comprehensive than Iran's military had believed. For China's planners who have built their entire anti-access strategy around the assumption that they can complicate and delay American kill chains enough to achieve their objectives before American combat power can be brought to bear decisively, this is an uncomfortable data point. The second lesson is about munitions consumption. The fact that 4 years into the Russia-Ukraine war, the United States faces munitions shortages for weapon systems that matter in a potential China-Taiwan scenario, from air and missile defense interceptors to Tomahawk cruise missiles, is something that analysts at the American Enterprise Institute described as nothing short of scandalous. Epic Fury consumed Tomahawk cruise missiles at a rate that has measurably reduced the inventory available for a Pacific contingency. Every SM-3 and SM-6 interceptor fired against Iranian ballistic missiles is an interceptor that is not in a launcher in the Western Pacific. Every precision-guided munition dropped on Iranian targets is a munition that is not pre-positioned for a Taiwan scenario. The industrial base that produces these weapons cannot replace them on the timeline that sustained combat operations consume them. China's military planners know the production rates. They know the inventory levels. They are calculating the gap between what is being consumed in the Middle East and what would be available if they moved on Taiwan in the next 6 to 18 months. The third lesson is about carrier vulnerability and carrier defense. Epic Fury showed that an American carrier strike group can defend itself effectively against ballistic missile attacks from a regional military with genuine missile capability. Iran's missiles did not come close to the Abraham Lincoln. The Aegis system, the SM-3 interceptors, the electronic warfare and cyber operations that degraded Iran's targeting architecture before a single missile fired, all of it worked. But China is not Iran. The DF-21D and DF-26 carrier killer missiles represent a qualitatively different problem than Iran's ballistic missile force. They have maneuvering re-entry vehicles specifically designed for the terminal guidance challenge of hitting a moving ship. They have ranges measured in thousands of kilometers, not hundreds. They are backed by a reconnaissance strike complex that includes over-the-horizon radar networks, space-based surveillance constellations, and submarine-based cueing systems that Iran never possessed. China watched the American carrier defense architecture perform against Iran's missiles and is now working to understand specifically what would be required to saturate or defeat it. Epic Fury gave them real data about how the system performs under pressure. That data is valuable to any adversary planning to challenge it. The fourth lesson is about the two-front problem. 3 carriers committed to CENTCOM means only 1 carrier immediately available in the Indo-Pacific. A PLA effort to intercept U.S. and allied forces aiming to relieve Taiwan during an invasion would require the PLAN to maintain a presence east of Taiwan and would rely heavily on the plan's ability to surge support ships to refuel and rearm its surface fleet during combat operations. The George Washington, forward deployed at Yokosuka, is the anchor of American naval deterrence in the Pacific right now. 1 carrier against a plan that now fields 3 carrier groups of its own, with the Fujin having demonstrated electromagnetic catapult launch capability and with a surface fleet that has grown faster than any in history over the past decade. Now let's build the hour-by-hour scenario. Not because it is inevitable, not because we believe China will move, but because understanding exactly what a Taiwan blockade would look like operationally is the only way to understand what American deterrence has to prevent and what the U.S. Navy would have to do to defeat it. Hour 0, the trigger. China does not announce a blockade. It announces a special military operation, a legal and sovereignty action to enforce the One China principle. This framing matters because it is designed to complicate the alliance response. It is not formally a declaration of war. It does not automatically activate treaty commitments. It creates a period of ambiguity in which every government watching has to make a decision about whether to treat it as an act of aggression requiring a military response or a legal dispute requiring a diplomatic one. China has been practicing this ambiguity in every exercise around Taiwan for years. Justice Mission 2025, described as practice for blocking major Taiwanese air and sea routes, was rehearsing exactly this initial phase. Simultaneously with the announcement, PLA rocket force units activate. Ballistic and cruise missile batteries that have been on elevated alert for days begin targeting known positions of American forces in the region. Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, the primary American air hub in the Western Pacific, is struck. Air and naval forces can operate from Guam with risk. Patriot and Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Batteries and Aegis ballistic missile defense ships have succeeded in shooting down many incoming missiles, but a lack of reloads is a concern. Kadena Air Base in Okinawa is struck. American base infrastructure in Japan forward deployed to put American combat power as close as possible to Taiwan becomes a primary target in the opening minutes of a conflict designed to push American forces back before they can respond. Hours 1 through 6. The plan activates its blockade formation. This is not a simple circle of ships around Taiwan. Justice Mission 2025 rehearsed operational elements of a campaign to isolate Taiwan, emphasizing the use of naval and Coast Guard assets to enforce the blockade while rehearsing counter-intervention operations. The blockade architecture involves multiple layers. An inner layer of Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels enforcing the legal fiction of a sovereignty action in the waters immediately adjacent to Taiwan. A middle layer of planned surface combatants, Type 052D and Type 055 destroyers equipped with HHQ-9B surface-to-air missiles and YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles, creating the air defense and anti-surface bubble that protects the blockade force from Taiwan's own military and from initial American intervention attempts. An outer layer of submarines, both nuclear and conventional, positioned along the approaches from Japan and from the Philippine Sea, designed to threaten any American carrier force attempting to close with Taiwan. The planned Type 055 destroyer, the Renhai class, is one of the most capable surface combatants in the world. Displacing over 12,000 tons, it carries 112 vertical launch cells, capable of firing a mix of surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, land attack missiles, and anti-submarine weapons. 44 of these ships and the Type 052D class of destroyers participated in Justice Mission 2025 exercises, their AESA radars providing a comprehensive air and surface picture around Taiwan that would make unsuppressed air operations in the strait extremely costly. Hours 6 through 24. Taiwan activates its own defenses. The Taiwanese military has prepared extensively for this scenario. Xiyongfeng, 3 supersonic anti-ship missiles deployed in shore batteries around the island's perimeter, engage planned surface ships attempting to close the blockade ring. Taiwanese F-16 SAOs and domestically produced FCK-1 fighters scrambled from hardened shelters specifically designed to survive the initial missile strikes that would open any Chinese operation, attempt to establish air superiority over the strait. PLA missile strikes on Taiwanese military infrastructure are ongoing. Taiwan's air defense radars, its command and control nodes, its naval bases, and its port facilities are all under attack. At sea, Taiwan's Hailong and Haipao class submarines, Dutch-built diesel-electric boats from the 1980s that have been kept operational through decades of difficult maintenance without access to their original manufacturer's support, attempt to operate against the planned surface fleet in the shallow, acoustically complex waters of the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan has also been constructing new indigenous defense submarines, with the first, the Haikun, launched in 2023. These boats, operating in waters they know intimately, represent one of Taiwan's most viable asymmetric options against a planned surface blockade force. Hours 24 through 48. This is the decisive window. American decision-making is happening in real time. The USS George Washington Strike Group, the sole carrier immediately available in the Pacific, is ordered to close with Taiwan. Its position at Yokosuka places it roughly 1,000 miles from the Taiwan Strait, a distance that requires roughly 3 to 4 days of high-speed transit. During that transit, the George Washington Strike Group is operating within range of land-based Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles. The DF-21D has a range of approximately 1,500 kilometers. The DF-26 has a range exceeding 4,000 kilometers. A carrier closing with Taiwan from Japan is within range of both systems for essentially the entire duration of its transit. The American response to this threat involves 3 simultaneous actions. First, submarines already positioned in the Pacific begin engaging the planned submarine threat that is trying to track and target the George Washington. This is the undersea battle that will shape every surface and air action that follows. If American submarines can attrite the planned submarine force that is hunting the George Washington, the carrier's transit becomes survivable. If they cannot, the carrier faces the prospect of a submarine attack while also operating within range of Chinese anti-ship ballistic missiles. Second, B-2 stealth bombers, launched from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, begin long-range strikes against PLA Rocket Force launch facilities on the Chinese mainland, specifically targeting the ballistic missile batteries that are providing the primary threat to the George Washington. This is a profound escalation. Striking the Chinese mainland is categorically different from every conventional military action the United States has taken since the Korean War. but it may be the only way to reduce the missile threat to the carrier strike group sufficiently to allow it to operate effectively. Third, the Typhoon ground-launched Tomahawk batteries deployed in the Philippines, positioned on Luzon in northern Philippines, begin engaging planned surface ships and shore-based military infrastructure, extending American strike reach without requiring carrier aviation to close within the plan's most lethal defensive envelope. Hours 48 through 72. The critical variables converge. If American strikes on the PLA rocket force have been sufficiently effective, if the undersea battle has gone in America's favor, and if Taiwanese defenses have held the inner blockade ring at sufficient cost, the George Washington's arrival in the Philippine Sea creates a viable intervention option. The carrier's air wing, operating from positions east of Taiwan, where the DF-21D range limitations begin to constrain China's targeting options, can begin striking planned surface ships in the blockade formation. F-35C flights from the George Washington, with their fifth-generation stealth and sensor fusion capability, represent the most serious threat to the planned surface formation that the American arsenal can provide in the opening days of a conflict. But here is the variable that makes this scenario genuinely terrifying for American planners: the munitions inventory. The U.S. is depleting its shrinking arsenal in the Middle East. The fact that America faces munitions shortages for weapon systems that matter in a potential China-Taiwan scenario, from air and missile defense interceptors to Tomahawk cruise missiles, is a significant concern for restoring deterrence in the Western Pacific. A sustained naval air campaign against a planned blockade force, firing SM-6 against incoming anti-ship missiles, expending Tomahawks against shore-based targets, consuming AIM-120 AMRAAMs in air-to-air engagements with PLAAF fighters, draws down inventories that are already reduced from 6 weeks of operations against Iran. The industrial base cannot replenish those inventories in the weeks that would separate an Iranian ceasefire from a Chinese blockade announcement. The reinforcement timeline adds another dimension of complexity. 3 carriers committed to CENTCOM cannot be immediately redeployed to the Pacific. Even if a ceasefire in the Middle East was achieved the day a Taiwan blockade began, repositioning the Abraham Lincoln or the Gerald R. Ford from the Arabian Sea or Red Sea to the Western Pacific requires a transit of roughly 3 to 4 weeks under peacetime steaming conditions. Under the urgency of a Taiwan crisis, with maximum speed and prioritized logistics, that timeline might be compressed to 2 to 3 weeks. But 2 to 3 weeks is an eternity in a conflict where the decisive military actions are unfolding in hours and days. China's strategic planners understand this timeline. They have been modeling it. Justice Mission 2025 was not just a rehearsal for the blockade itself. It was a rehearsal conducted at the moment when American attention and resources were concentrated on the Iranian nuclear crisis, when the military buildup that would become Operation Epic Fury was already underway. The timing of Justice Mission 2025 launched on December 29, 2025. Just as American forces were positioning for what would become Epic Fury 2 months later, was not coincidental. China was testing its own readiness, testing American attention, and beginning to accumulate the operational experience that a real blockade would require. The ISW and AEI's Coalition Defense of Taiwan Project Assessment is direct about the implications. The plan is likely enhancing its ability to operate at longer ranges from its immediate waters. The plan could use out-of-area deployments to enhance its anti-access and area denial network in the Pacific during a PLA blockade or invasion of Taiwan. This is not a theoretical future capability. It is a current development that is being tracked and documented in real time. Chinese naval vessels that were once confined to the near seas are now conducting deployments into the Pacific that were unimaginable a decade ago. The Fujian Carrier Group, with its electromagnetic catapult and its J-35 stealth fighters, represents a force that can provide naval aviation coverage east of Taiwan, complicating the George Washington's intervention options from the moment it begins its transit from Yokosuka. The diplomatic dimension of the blockade scenario is where China believes it has its greatest advantage. A blockade is not an invasion. It does not cross the threshold that would automatically generate unified Allied military response. Japan's Prime Minister Takaichi stated in November 2025 that a Chinese blockade of Taiwan would constitute a threat to Japan's survival, requiring mobilization of the Japanese Self-Defense Force. China responded by stopping Japanese seafood imports, canceling cultural events, and deploying naval and air assets to the waters between Japan and Taiwan. The message was clear: intervention has costs, and those costs are calibrated to be high enough to create hesitation in any government that has to weigh the immediate economic and military costs of intervention against the longer-term strategic cost of allowing Taiwan to fall. The United States committed to epic fury in the Middle East, managing the domestic political fallout of a war that has cost $11 billion in its first 6 days, facing Allied criticism from Spain and others about unilateral military action, and watching its munitions inventories decline, is not in its optimal position to project unambiguous deterrence in the Pacific simultaneously. That is exactly the situation China has been waiting to see. This does not mean China will move. The analytical consensus among serious scholars of Chinese military strategy at ISW, AEI, RAND, CSIS, and the major American service war colleges is that Beijing is unlikely to provide substantive material support to Iran and is unlikely to move on Taiwan as a direct consequence of epic fury. The risks for China remain very high. American submarines in the Pacific are positioned and ready regardless of the Middle East commitment. The Typhoon batteries in the Philippines represent a ground-launched Tomahawk capability that can strike planned surface ships without requiring carrier aviation to close with the threat. American allies Japan and Australia have invested significantly in their own capabilities, and Japan's new security posture under Prime Minister Takaichi is meaningfully more assertive than any previous Japanese governments. The cost of getting it wrong, of launching a blockade that the United States and its allies successfully defeat, would be catastrophic for Chinese Communist Party legitimacy in ways that the party cannot easily absorb. But the window, the convergence of reduced Pacific carrier coverage, depleted munitions inventories, divided American attention, and Chinese military readiness demonstrated in Justice Mission 2025 is a combination of factors that will not persist indefinitely. The munitions can be rebuilt, given time and industrial priority. The carriers in the Middle East will eventually redeploy. American attention will eventually refocus on the Pacific. The window that exists right now is temporary. Whether Xi Jinping sees the same window that American analysts see, and whether his risk calculations lead him to the same conclusion that analysts recommend against, is the question that will define the next 12 months of global security. The U.S. Navy has 1 carrier in the Pacific. China has 3 carriers and is building more. The war in the Middle East has consumed munitions that cannot be replaced quickly, and China just conducted its largest Taiwan blockade exercise in 3 years, timed precisely to when American forces were looking the other way. The watch continues. The window is open. If you want to understand how the U.S. Navy is planning to restore deterrence in the Pacific after epic fury, what the Typhoon missile deployment in the Philippines actually changes about the strategic balance, and what a realistic defense of Taiwan would look like given the current force posture, subscribe to Navy Power Decoded. This is the analysis that matters. 1 carrier, 3 directions, and China is watching every move.